The night before my wedding, I drove back to my fiancé's apartment for a sweater, and somewhere in that 15-minute drive, I made the decision to call off the biggest day of my life. I was already most of the way from Grant's building in Capitol Hill to my little rented studio in Fremont when it hit me. I actually gasped out loud, alone in the car, like someone had said my name from the back seat. The cardigan. I had left it draped over the arm of his mother's good sofa, the one nobody was allowed to actually sit on. A chill went through me that had nothing to do with the window I'd cracked to keep myself awake. It wasn't the damp Seattle night air sliding in through the 2 inches of open glass. It was the sweater itself. It sounds like such a small thing to turn a car around for. A sweater. But this wasn't any sweater. It was a soft dove-gray cardigan, thin merino, with a gentle open neckline, and along the collar my mother had hand-stitched a small sprig of lavender, petal by petal, thread by thread, like she was trying to sew her whole life into a piece of fabric she knew she wouldn't be alive to see me wear on my wedding day. I hit the brakes harder than I meant to. The tires gave a short, ugly screech against the wet asphalt, and the car behind me swerved and leaned on its horn. I lifted a hand in an apologetic little wave I didn't feel, checked the mirror, and cut across 2 lanes to the turn lane like a woman who'd just remembered she'd left the stove on. Except it wasn't the stove. It was the last thing my mother's hands had ever made for me. Tomorrow was my wedding day. I was supposed to already be home, in bed, hair pinned back with an old t-shirt so I wouldn't wreck it before the stylist arrived at 7. I was supposed to be dreaming about flowers and vows and the specific way the light comes through the windows of the Fairmont Ballroom at 4 in the afternoon. Instead, I was driving back to my future mother-in-law's building for a cardigan, and if you'd asked me right then why it mattered so much, I don't know if I could have explained it in a way that made sense to anyone but me. But I felt somewhere under my ribs that it was the last thread still connecting me to my mother, to her blessing, to the version of kindness she had spent her whole life trying to teach me, usually without saying a single word about it. The morning I moved out of our old house for good, she had stood in the doorway with that cardigan already folded over her arm, waiting for me like she'd known I would need it before I did. Her hands were shaking a little as she smoothed the collar flat against my collarbone. "You'll be somebody's wife soon, sweetheart," she'd said. "Wear this to keep warm." I put 2 little flowers on the collar. One for peace, one for safety. "That's all I ever wanted for you, baby. Peace. And to be safe." Her voice had already started to go thin by then. Her breath had that shallow, effortful sound that I didn't want to name out loud, even in my own head. 6 weeks later, she was gone. She died in early winter, on a night a lot like this one. Cold enough to see your breath. The kind of cold that gets into your chest and makes grief feel physical. I cried until there was nothing left in my throat to cry with. And then I did the thing women in my family have always done. I got quiet. I went to work. I saved. I told myself that if I could just buy a home, a real one, with my name on the deed, some part of my mother could finally rest, even though she was already resting in the one place none of us can follow. That cardigan wasn't a piece of clothing. It was a message. And there was no way I was going to leave a message from my dead mother sitting on someone else's sofa the night before I married into that family. I pulled up outside Grant's building. It was one of those handsome older brick buildings in Capitol Hill, with a lobby that always smelled faintly of lemon polish, pale yellow light spilling out through the glass doors onto the sidewalk. The wind moved through the maples along the block, and the leaves made that dry, papery whisper they make right before they finally let go for the season. I got out of the car. My heels clicked against the pavers, too loud in the quiet street. In the reflection of the lobby door, I caught a glimpse of myself, hair still slightly wavy from the trial updo earlier that day, a soft rose lipstick, a thin, careful line of eyeliner. A woman one sunrise away from being a bride. I told myself out loud. quietly. "Harper, calm down. Tomorrow is supposed to be the happiest day of your life." I stepped into the elevator. In the brushed steel of the wall, I caught my own reflection smiling back at me, except it wasn't really a smile. It was the shape of one, put on for my own benefit. The way you might rehearse an expression in a mirror before a job interview. I had spent the last several months preparing for tomorrow, like I was preparing to walk into a whole new life. The dress, the one my mother and I had chosen together 9 months before she passed, had cost $9,500. She'd gasped a little at the number. "Mom, you only get married once," I'd told her. "I want to feel beautiful. Just this once." She'd smiled at that, eyes shining with tears she didn't quite let fall. "My girl knows how to take care of herself now," she said. I didn't understand then how much weight she'd put behind that sentence. I understand it now. Grant had booked the ballroom at the Fairmont downtown almost a year in advance, put down a deposit to lock it in. The condo we were supposed to move into together, the one meant to be the first real chapter of our married life, was in Ballard, walking distance from a well-regarded international school, a hospital, and a park with a view of the water. 1,100 square feet. And it was in my name. 6 years of saving from my job, plus what my mother left me, had been just enough to cover the down payment and qualify for the mortgage on my own. Grant had been so easy about it at the time, so warm. "It's fine that it's just your name on the deed," he'd told me, squeezing my hand across the kitchen table. "We're about to be husband and wife. What's yours is mine, and what's mine is yours. That's how this works, Harper." I believed him. I believed him with everything 29 years old and 5 years of history could offer. I believed in us. I'd met Grant 5 years earlier, at a company retreat outside Portland. I had just been promoted to project manager. He was the new senior engineer everybody was already talking about. That weekend, I'd won a raffle. The newest model laptop, still in its box. And Grant had jogged across the room to help me carry it to my car, laughing about how ridiculous it was that I'd won the one prize too heavy to carry alone. "Congratulations," he'd said, and smiled at me in a way that felt like a warm breeze on a cold day. The kind of smile that makes you soften before you even think to put your guard up. The first time I met his mother, Pamela, she took both my hands in hers like she'd been waiting for me her whole life. Her voice was sugar-sweet. "I like you so much already, honey," she'd said. "You seem like a good, hard-working girl. Not like these girls today, always preening in the mirror, not a clue how to actually take care of a family." I remember how moved I was. I remember thinking, genuinely, that I had found a second family, one that would love me the way mine once had. Grant's younger sister Brooke, still in college back then, used to text me constantly about her plans for after graduation, telling me she wanted to be independent and successful, just like me. I bought her 2 books on career development as a graduation present. I meant it with my whole heart. All of it flashed through my head in the space of a single elevator ride, like a film reel running too fast to properly watch. The elevator chimed softly and opened onto Grant's floor. I stepped into the hallway. The motion sensor light flicked on above me. I stood in front of their apartment door and took a breath. All I had to do was ring the bell, laugh a little, say something like, "I'm so sorry, I left my cardigan again," grab it, and go home. Simple. I lifted my hand. My finger hovered an inch from the doorbell. And in that exact second, a voice came from inside. Pamela's voice, loud and clear, completely unconcerned with being overheard, like she was talking to someone on speakerphone and had forgotten there were walls between her and the rest of the world. "Oh, that Harper finally left. God, that smile of hers makes my skin crawl. So fake it's almost impressive." I froze. My finger hung in midair like it belonged to someone else. A second voice, younger, needling, Delighted, answered her. Mom, you should win an award. I almost lost it watching you fawn all over her tonight. I swallowed. Cold sweat broke out along my spine so fast it felt like someone had opened a window behind me. A single, stupid question spun uselessly in my head. Why are they talking like this? Inside, Pamela let out a satisfied laugh, the kind of laugh you give when you've just won a hand of cards you were never supposed to win. Brooke's voice again, eager as a kid who'd just been handed a present. And after the wedding, the condo's basically Grant's too, right? Getting the deed transferred should be easy once they're married. Then we sell it. That's more than enough for Grant to finally start his own firm. Right, Mom? My ears were ringing. My heart was slamming so hard against my ribs I was sure they could hear it through the door. Transferred. Sold. Each word landed like an open-handed slap, not against my cheek, but somewhere much deeper, my sense of who I was to these people. Pamela kept going, her voice growing looser, more careless, like she was talking about a used car she was about to flip for profit, rather than a woman about to become her daughter-in-law. And it's not just the condo. That mother of hers was some kind of businesswoman, from what I understand. She must have left behind a decent nest egg, too. A short, satisfied pause. After the wedding, we'll have Grant work on her a little. Sweet-talk her into letting us hold the purse strings for the household. Brooke wants a car. I want the kitchen redone. Harper's mother will help us with that, one way or another. I put a hand flat against the hallway wall because my legs had genuinely stopped holding me up on their own. Cold sweat soaked straight through the back of my blouse. My whole head felt like it had been packed in ice. Every warm word Pamela had ever said to me, every squeeze of the hand, every, "I think of you like my own daughter," curdled instantly into something sour and grotesque. Inside, their laughter kept going, easy and unbothered, while I stood frozen just outside their door, my hand still hovering by the bell, unable to press it, unable to move, feeling like the entire architecture of my life had just been quietly rearranged behind my back while I wasn't looking. The wooden door in front of me never opened, but the words coming through it cut deeper than anything a blade could have done. 5 years of what I'd believed was love, the family dinners, the warm handshakes, the birthday cards signed, "Love Mom," had all been a performance, carefully staged, and I had been the most naive person in the room every single time the curtain went up. Pamela's voice kept going, entirely unaware that the woman she was about to make her daughter-in-law was standing 3 feet away, hearing every word. And one more thing for tomorrow. Brooke, at the reception, tear up a little when you give your toast, all right? Talk about how much Grant adores Harper, how devoted he is. Let both sides of the family see what a responsible, loving man my son turned out to be. Brooke giggled. Mom, relax. I've got it handled. During the toasts, I'm going to make sure Harper's glass never sits empty. Once she's had a few, she'll be a lot easier to manage. I shuddered where I stood. Not from the cold. From something closer to nausea. Somewhere inside me, something that had been holding together for 5 years simply gave way, all at once, without any warning. This wasn't love. It had never been love. It was a story I'd been told because I was useful to it. A story that promised that if I was sincere enough, patient enough, generous enough, I would eventually earn a family in return for my devotion. I closed my eyes and took one long breath. No tears came. Maybe the shock was too large for that yet. Or maybe some pain simply outruns the body's ability to cry about it in real time. There were no more why questions circling in my head. Only one thought. So clear it almost felt like someone else had placed it there for me. I have to save myself. I opened my purse. My hands were shaking, but my mind, strangely, had never felt more awake. I pulled out my phone, thumbed open the voice memo app, and crouched slightly. bringing the phone close to the thin gap of light under the door. Inside, the conversation kept unspooling, growing bolder by the minute. "Once the wedding's done, our problems are over," Pamela was saying. "That girl is the proper image-conscious type, terrified of gossip. Even if she wanted to make a fuss later, she wouldn't dare." "Exactly, Mom," Brooke agreed. "Everyone on the outside will just see a good, respectable family. If she's ever the one who asks for a divorce, people will tear her apart for being an ungrateful, difficult woman. Nobody will blame us." I heard every syllable. My chest felt like it was being wrung out like a wet towel, but my hand didn't shake. 3 minutes passed like 3 years. When I felt I had enough, I stopped the recording and slid the phone back into my purse. I straightened my spine. The trembling had stopped. My mind, in that moment, was as clear as glass. I would never walk through that door as anyone's daughter-in-law. I turned and walked quickly toward the elevator, my heels loud against the stone floor, louder than they'd been on the way in, each step feeling like it was stamping out the last fragile pieces of my own past. In the elevator mirror, my reflection looked back at me, pale, lips pressed into a thin line, eyes empty but strangely cold and steady. I looked at that woman and laughed, quietly, bitterly. "Harper, you have been such a fool," I thought. "But at least you woke up before it was too late." The car carried me through the dark, and the streetlights of Seattle blurred into long smears of gold through the window. Somewhere around the I-5 exit, I remembered the cardigan again, my mother's cardigan, still sitting on that sofa I would now never sit on as anyone's wife. My hand tightened on the wheel. Something inside me fought about it, hard, for almost a full mile. I wanted to go back for it. I wanted to so badly it ached somewhere under my sternum. But the thought of ringing that doorbell again, of standing in front of those two women and pretending I hadn't heard what I'd heard, turned my stomach in a way I couldn't argue myself out of. "It doesn't matter," I said out loud, to no one, my voice flat in the empty car. "Not anymore." A cardigan that had spent even one night in that apartment already felt stained to me, not with dust, but with the character of the people who lived there. I turned the wheel, not back toward Capitol Hill, but straight toward my rented studio in Fremont. It was 400 square feet, a bedroom barely big enough for the bed, a living area that folded into a kitchenette if you looked at it wrong. But that night, it was the only place on earth that felt safe. I opened the door and a cool draft slid past me from the cracked window. I flipped on the light. On the hanger by the closet hung my wedding dress, ivory, catching the moonlight through the blinds, the layers of tulle glowing with a cold, fragile shimmer, like a beautiful dream that had never once been sturdy enough to actually hold weight. I stood and looked at it for a long time. Then I laughed, quietly, at myself, as much as at the dress. "Look at you," I said. "So beautiful you almost buried me alive." I walked to the window and pulled the curtain back a few inches. The damp smell of the city drifted in, wet pavement, somebody's dinner, distant traffic. I opened a drawer and found an old pack of cigarettes I hadn't touched in over a year. I lit one anyway. I needed something, anything, to keep my mind sharp that night. And the ritual of it, the small flare of the lighter, the first stinging pull of smoke, did the job better than any pep talk could have. In the haze, an old memory surfaced. Grant, 3 years into our relationship, lying next to me one night and asking, half joking, half not, "Harper, if I ended up poor one day, would you look down on me?" I remembered laughing, patting his chest. "If we're broke, we'll work on it together," I'd told him. "I don't need money. I need you to be a good person." Looking back at it now, from the middle of this particular night, my own words sounded almost unbearably naive. Grant's family wasn't poor in any way that mattered. They were, I understood now, pour in something much harder to fix. My phone buzzed on the counter. Grant's name lit up the screen. I stared at it for several long seconds before I finally answered. "Harper, are you home yet?" His voice was gentle, as it always was. "You didn't text." I got worried. I leaned against the wall, and my own voice came out so level it almost surprised me. "I'm home." "Good. Was today at my mom's a lot? You seemed a little quiet leaving." I almost laughed out loud. "Yeah," I said instead. "It was a lot." Grant chuckled, warm and easy, utterly unaware of what I now knew. "My mom really does love you, you know. She wouldn't stop talking about you after you left. Big day tomorrow, huh?" I watched the last of the cigarette smoke curl up toward the ceiling and dissolve. "Grant," I said slowly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Anything." "Do you love me?" There was a beat of silence on the other end that told me more than any answer could have. "Why are you asking me that all of a sudden?" He laughed, a little awkwardly. "Of course I love you. Why else would I be marrying you tomorrow?" "Just wondering," I said. "Ignore me. Pre-wedding nerves, I guess. Get some sleep. We've got an early morning." "Okay. Love you. Try to sleep too." I hung up and set the phone face down on the couch cushion beside me. My heart didn't ache. It had gone somewhere colder than that. Somewhere very still. The 3-minute recording sitting in my purse felt like a block of ice against my hip. But it was also, strangely, the only thing keeping me upright. I looked at the wedding dress again, and then around the small room that held every piece of my adult life. The job, the savings, this apartment, the plans I'd built with my own 2 hands long before Grant Whitfield ever walked into it. "It's okay," I told myself. "Tomorrow might not be a wedding day, but it can be the first day I actually start living for myself." I put the cigarette out, turned off the light, and lay down without undressing. Sleep, when it finally came near dawn, was thin and restless, but at least the worst of the shaking had stopped by then. Somewhere in the small hours, a cold clarity had settled over everything, quiet and absolute, like the first hard frost of the season. I barely slept that night, not because of tears. None had come yet, but because my mind refused to slow down. It was frighteningly, almost clinically awake. Every detail replayed on a loop I couldn't shut off. Pamela's honeyed voice through the door, Brooke's giggle, the casual, businesslike way they'd discussed selling a home I hadn't even finished decorating yet. Around 4 in the morning, I sat up, turned on the desk lamp, and pulled open the bottom drawer of the second-hand dresser I'd had since college. Inside was a neat folder of documents, the deed to the Ballard condo, issued solely in my name, 6 years of pay stubs, my employment contract, and a small brown envelope. Inside the envelope was a debit card my mother had left me before she died, tied to an account she'd quietly built up over decades without ever once mentioning the balance to a single living soul, including me, until near the end. I remembered her hand around mine in the hospital, her voice thin but very clear. "Harper, keep this safe. Don't ever tell his family about it. Not one word, or I swear I won't rest easy." At the time, I'd almost laughed it off. "Mom, you worry too much," I'd told her. Sitting there at 4 in the morning with the recording of my future mother-in-law calmly discussing how to drain that same account, I understood, all at once, exactly how much my mother had already seen coming, years before I ever let myself notice it. I opened my laptop, not to search anything work-related, but to look up a name I hadn't called in months, my mother's oldest friend, Corinne Voss, a civil litigation attorney who had known me since I was in braces. When my mother was still alive, Corinne used to sit at our kitchen table and say the same thing to me, almost every visit. "This one needs to learn to be strong. Don't ever let anyone push you around, baby." I looked at the clock. 5 in the morning. My hand hovered over the keyboard, then I closed the laptop. It wasn't time yet. First, I needed to think this through with total clarity. If I called off the wedding, Grant's family would be furious. Relatives on both sides would whisper. Coworkers would ask careful, prying questions. Some people would sympathize. Others would blame me. Most would simply watch from a safe distance and form opinions. But if I didn't call it off, I stood to lose my home, my savings, and this was the part that mattered most. My own self-respect, piece by piece, for the rest of my life. Compared to that, what were a few weeks of gossip? I asked myself one simple question. If Mom were still here, what would she want me to do? The answer came faster than I expected. She would want me to live. To actually live, for myself, instead of slowly disappearing into the shape of what somebody else's family needed me to be. The sky outside had begun to lighten by then, pale gray slipping between the blinds. I got up, splashed cold water on my face in the bathroom, and looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes had changed sometime in the last few hours. Gone was the soft, dreamy look of a woman on the edge of her wedding day. In its place was something calmer, harder, and far more sure of itself. "All right," I told the woman in the mirror. "Let's do this." I changed out of the pajamas I hadn't slept properly in and put on work clothes instead. A crisp white blouse, black slacks, hair pulled back into a tight, no-nonsense bun. Not a bride's outfit. The outfit of a woman about to handle the single most important piece of business of her entire life. I made coffee, black, and let the bitterness sit on my tongue while, in my head, a short list of steps arranged itself with startling clarity. 1. Cancel the wedding, in writing, no elaboration. 2. Block contact to avoid being talked out of it. 3. Get legal counsel to protect what's mine, clean. Simple. No hedging. My phone buzzed. A text from Brooke. "Get to bed early tonight, the bride has to look perfect tomorrow." I read it and laughed. A laugh with no bitterness left in it at all. Just something close to disbelief at my own past patience. I didn't answer her. Instead, I opened my messages and found Grant's name. His profile photo was still the two of us laughing on a hiking trail near Mount Rainier the summer before. I looked at it for a few seconds, then typed, slowly, one word at a time. "Grant, the wedding is off. We are not getting married." No explanation. No exclamation points. No softening. I hit send. The little status line changed to delivered. My heart sped up for one sharp second, then, unexpectedly, slowed down again, like something enormous had just rolled off my shoulders and out of my body entirely. Almost immediately, the phone began to buzz without stopping. Grant calling. Then Pamela. Then Brooke. I watched the screen light up over and over, calmly, and then powered the phone off completely. Not because I was afraid, because I already knew that nothing they said in that moment would be the truth. They didn't need the truth from me. They only ever needed what I could give them. I sat in the chair by the window, watching the first real sunlight of the day spill across the floor. A new day had begun. Not a wedding day. The day I started taking my own life back. One deliberate decision at a time. Attorney Corinne Voss arrived at my studio apartment while the morning was still in full swing outside. She wore a gray blazer, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, her expression serious but her eyes, as always, warm underneath it. She looked around the small room the second she stepped in, her gaze catching on the wedding dress still hanging by the closet before it settled back on me. "Are you okay?" she asked. I nodded, and the smile that came wasn't the trembling one from the night before. It was strangely steady. "I'm okay, Aunt Corinne. I don't think I've ever had my head this clear in my whole life." She didn't push for details right away. She set her bag down, took the chair across from me, and pulled out a small notepad and pen. Tell me everything, from the very beginning. Don't leave anything out, no matter how small it feels. So I told her. I told her about going back for the cardigan, about every single word I'd heard through that door, about the 3-minute recording still saved on my phone. When I finally played it for her, out loud in that tiny room, time seemed to stop moving entirely. Corinne listened without interrupting once. When the recording ended, she let out a long breath. "You were lucky," she said slowly. "Extraordinarily lucky that you happened to hear this. And even luckier that your instincts told you to record it instead of just running." I laughed, a little bitterly. I never in a million years thought I'd have to do something like that. "That's how it goes sometimes," Corinne said. "Some lessons cost you almost everything before they teach you anything. But if you don't learn them, the next round costs even more." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder of blank legal paper. "Now listen to me carefully. First, you do not waver, not once, no matter what they try. This family is going to attempt everything: calls, ambush visits, tears, guilt, threats. Their entire goal will be to make you doubt yourself long enough to change your mind." I nodded. "Second, every property in your name stays in your name. Under no circumstances do you hand over an original document to anyone. Understood?" "Understood." "Third," she looked me directly in the eye, "if you have to speak to any of them at all from this point forward, you do it with me on the line, or not at all." Her words weren't meant to comfort me. They were a lifeline thrown at exactly the moment I needed one. As if summoned by the conversation itself, my phone rang. Grant's name lit up the screen. I looked at Corinne. She gave a small, steady nod, and I answered, putting it on speaker and setting it flat on the table between us. "Harper, where are you?" Grant's voice wasn't gentle anymore. It was rushed, sharp at the edges. "Do you have any idea what you're doing right now?" "I'm home," I said, my voice flat. "What home? By what right do you cancel our wedding without even talking to me about it first?" "Grant," I said. "I sent you a very clear message. The wedding is off. We are not getting married." "For what reason?" His voice climbed. "Tell me. You cannot just do something this insane out of nowhere." "Insane?" I let out a short laugh. "You really want to know the reason?" "Yes. I want to hear it." I didn't answer him right away. Instead, I picked up the phone and played the recording. Pamela's voice, Brooke's voice, every word landing clearly into the silence of the room on the other end of the call. Dead air followed. Nothing but Grant's ragged breathing. When the recording finished, I spoke again. "Do you still want to hear the reason?" A long silence. Finally, Grant's voice came back, all its earlier confidence gone. "Harper, listen. About that. Let me explain. My mom was just talking. She didn't mean any of it seriously." "Really?" I said. "And the condo? My mother's money? The plan to get me drunk at my own reception?" "Harper, I've already heard everything I need to hear," I said, cutting him off. "The wedding is off. That's final." Grant's patience finally cracked. "Don't overreact. Everything's arranged. The guests, the venue, both families. If you cancel this, you're going to humiliate everyone." I let out a bitter little laugh. "And did it ever once occur to you that I was about to lose my entire life?" Before Grant could answer, another voice cut in over the line. Pamela's. "Harper, sweetheart, don't listen to some recording out of context and jump to conclusions. Everything I said was out of concern for your future, yours and Grant's." I looked out the window at the too bright morning sun. "Pamela," I said slowly, "you don't have to keep performing. I heard all of it." "How dare you speak to me that way?" Pamela snapped, her voice rising sharply. "I've treated you like my own daughter. If you'd actually treated me like a daughter, I said, you wouldn't have been planning to sell my condo out from under me. There was a pause, and then Corinne leaned toward the phone, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. Good morning, Pamela. My name is Corinne Voss. As of this morning, I represent Harper as her legal counsel. Going forward, all communication with her goes through me. Any threats, defamation, or attempts to fraudulently move assets will be documented and reported to the appropriate authorities. Total silence on the other end. After a long moment, Grant spoke again, his tone considerably lower. Harper, do you really want to make this so complicated? I'm not the one who complicated it, I said. I'm the one who stopped it before it went any further. And I hung up. The room went quiet again, but it wasn't the same suffocating silence from the night before. It was the kind of quiet that follows a storm that's finally passed through. Corinne looked at me, and there was something close to pride in her eyes. You handled that better than most people twice your age would have, she said. I sank into my chair and let out a long breath. I'm not as devastated as I thought I'd be, Aunt Corinne. I think it's because I woke up in time. I glanced over at the wedding dress hanging by the closet. For the first time since the night before, I felt not one flicker of regret. I want to ask you for one more thing, I said. The money Grant's family has borrowed from me over the years. I want it back. Corinne nodded. Get me the transaction records. I'll handle the rest. I walked to the desk and pulled open the drawer, and there it all was, receipt after receipt. Each one a small, dated reminder of my own naivety. Thank goodness I actually kept all of this, I murmured. Corinne smiled slightly. It's not luck. It's the result of you being far more careful than you gave yourself credit for. Outside, Seattle was moving through its ordinary Saturday morning. People heading to weddings, offering congratulations, believing in beautiful pictures they hadn't yet been given a reason to question. Meanwhile, in this small rented room, I was quietly dismantling a trap that had taken 5 years to build. I knew the storm wasn't over yet. But for the first time in a long time, I was standing on the right side of it. By early afternoon, my little apartment had turned into something closer to a strategic command post. Corinne pulled a chair up to the desk, opened her laptop, and organized documents into neat, deliberate stacks. I made more coffee and set a mug in front of her, then sat down across the table. There was no small talk left between us. We worked like two people solving a difficult equation where the unknown variable was the rest of my life. Give me every transaction, Corinne said. The more detail, the better. I nodded and opened the folder I'd assembled overnight. 17 separate transfers, each one attached to a different story. A sudden family emergency. Brooke's tuition, due sooner than expected. A repair on Pamela's roof. A short-term loan to help Grant bridge a gap before a bonus came through. The amounts ranged from $300 to as much as $6,000, adding up to well over $11,000 across 5 years. Corinne read through the list slowly, the way you'd read an indictment. First transfer to Pamela's account. Memo, temporary loan. Second, same account. Third, to Brooke. I smiled a little bitterly. I thought about it so simply back then. They're family. Family helps family when things get hard. Corinne looked up at me over her glasses. You didn't make a mistake by helping people, Harper. You made a mistake by helping the same people, over and over, long after it was obvious they had no intention of ever helping you back. Her words drew a short, surprisingly light laugh out of me. The kind of laugh you give when someone finally says out loud the thing you've felt in your chest for years, but never let yourself name. My phone kept buzzing throughout the afternoon. Messages piled up from Grant. Harper, please just hear me out. From Brooke. We can talk about this like adults. Why are you making such a scene? An unfamiliar number called twice. I looked at it and let it ring out both times. Corinne glanced at my phone and waved a hand. Don't answer. They're testing how much pressure it takes before you crack. I silenced the ringer and set the phone face down. In an odd way, I found the whole situation almost funny. Today, I was supposed to be sitting in a salon chair, getting my hair curled, sipping champagne with bridesmaids. Instead, I was tallying up every dollar I'd ever handed over out of misplaced loyalty, preparing to demand it back. Nobody could write a script this absurd. Life apparently didn't need our help to be strange. By mid-afternoon, Corinne had finished drafting the demand letter. The language was clean, specific, entirely without drama. I read it over like I was reading somebody else's story. Sign it, she said, sliding it across the table. I picked up the pen and signed my name with a steadiness that would have been unthinkable 24 hours earlier. Done, Corinne said, closing the folder. I'll send this out today. If they're smart, they'll negotiate. If they're not, we have more than enough grounds to make this very uncomfortable for them. I let out a long breath. Aunt Corinne, I feel lighter than I have in years. Mostly because I finally stopped lying to myself. Late that afternoon, after Corinne had gone, I sat alone in the quiet for the first time all day. Sunlight streamed across the room, catching the white wedding dress still hanging in the corner. I got up, walked over, and let the fabric slide gently through my fingers. I'm sorry, I said softly, to a dress that couldn't hear me. Turns out you were never really meant for me after all. I took it off the hanger, folded it with more care than I expected to have left in me, and laid it in its box. I didn't know yet what I'd eventually do with it. But I knew one thing with total certainty. I was never going to wear it to walk into a life built entirely on someone else's lie. The phone rang again. Grant, calling from his work line this time. I looked at it for a long moment before answering. Harper? His voice was hoarse. Do you really want to take this all the way? I leaned back in my chair, my voice even. I just want back what belongs to me. The money will be returned. But please, stop calling me directly. Everything goes through my lawyer now. We were together 5 years, he said quietly. You're really going to throw all of that away over a few sentences you overheard? It's not about a few sentences, I said. It's about the way all of you looked at me the entire time, and I just never let myself see it. Silence on his end. I'll talk to my mother, he finally said. Talk to whoever you want, I told him. But from here on out, anything involving money or my name goes through my legal counsel. I hung up. No trembling this time, no hesitation. That evening, I made myself a simple dinner and ate it alone, listening to quiet music, and for the first time in days, my head wasn't a storm of noise. I thought, almost with disbelief, that if none of this had happened, I might have spent the rest of my life as a patient, endlessly giving wife, functioning as a permanent emergency fund for a family who had never once seen me as anything more than useful. The thought made me shiver. Then I laughed. I dodged a bullet, I told myself. And for once, I actually believed it. The next morning, I woke to my alarm at 6:30, exactly the time I'd have gotten up for work on any ordinary day. For one disoriented half-second, I thought I should be sitting in front of a mirror somewhere, listening to the roar of a blow dryer, breathing in the smell of setting spray and bridal panic. Then the memory of the last 24 hours landed all at once, and the feeling that followed wasn't grief. It was relief. So large it nearly took my breath away. I stretched, opened the window, and let the cool morning air in. Seattle was doing its rare thing that day. Clear sky, actual sunlight hitting the rooftops across the street, warming everything it touched. An entirely ordinary morning. And it was that very ordinariness that made me feel, for the first time in a long time, genuinely safe. I got dressed for work like any other day. White blouse, black slacks, flats. Nobody at the office knew that this had been meant to be my wedding day, and I intended to keep it that way. It was mine to hold on to, and I preferred it stay private. Just as I stepped out of my building, my phone buzzed. Not Grant this time. An unknown number. I stared at it a few seconds, then answered. Hello, is this Harper? A middle-aged man's voice, stern. This is she. Who's calling? This is Grant's uncle. Tell me what on earth happened between you two. This whole family is in shock over how you're behaving. I stopped at the top of the stairs, one hand on the railing. Which version would you like to hear, sir? The one that makes me look bad, or the true one? The true one, obviously. A wedding is not a small thing to walk away from. If there's a problem, you talk it out. You don't turn it into a circus. You're right, I said. Big things deserve to be laid out clearly. The truth is, I'm not getting married, and I have very good reasons for it. What reasons could possibly be that good? I had no intention of explaining myself to a man I'd met exactly twice. If you want the reasons, I'd encourage you to contact my attorney. She has all the evidence you could want. There was a short pause. Then his tone softened, just slightly. Harper, you and Grant were together a long time. Your uncle here just hopes you'll reconsider. I've reconsidered very carefully, I said. My decision isn't changing. I hung up. Walking to the office, the wind moving through my hair, I realized the storm in my chest had already quieted considerably. I knew there'd be more calls like that one, but they had already started to feel like small waves against a shore, no longer strong enough to knock me over. At the office, everything was ordinary. Coworkers said good morning, asked about a project deadline, and no one mentioned a wedding, because as far as anyone knew, there hadn't been one to cancel. Maybe it was because I've always been a fairly private person, or maybe everyone was simply absorbed in their own lives. Either way, I noticed something that morning that surprised me. The world had kept turning without the slightest interruption, wedding or no wedding. It had only ever felt like the center of the universe inside my own head. At lunch, my phone buzzed again. Pamela this time. I looked at the name, sighed, and answered anyway. Harper. Her voice had gone entirely soft, almost unrecognizably gentle. Where are you, honey? At work. What is it? Can I come see you? Just to talk, the two of us. I laughed quietly. I don't think there's anything left for us to say to each other. You're angry at me, she said. I'm an old woman. I say foolish things sometimes. Please forgive me. I looked out the window at the sunlight falling across my desk. I'm not angry. I just don't trust you anymore. What do you mean by that? I mean that from now on, everything gets discussed with my attorney. I don't need to hear any more explanations. Her tone flipped instantly, all the softness gone. Harper, do you really think that because you have a little money, you can push people around? This family has its pride too. I laughed, low and a little bitter. Pride isn't in what you say, Pamela. It's in what you do. I hung up and blocked her number on the spot. My hand shook a little, but my chest felt lighter than it had in days, like I'd just locked a door that should have been shut a long time ago. Later that afternoon, Corinne texted. They received the demand letter. They want to negotiate. I bit my lip and typed back. Please handle it, Aunt Corinne. I don't want to see any of them. Don't worry, she wrote back. Focus on your own life. I've got this. I put the phone away and went back to work, and my mind, for once, wasn't crowded with images of Grant's family. Instead, it was full of ordinary things, deadlines, a client call, a spreadsheet that needed fixing. That mundanity felt like solid ground under my feet for the first time in what felt like years. After work, I stopped by the grocery store below my building. Standing in the checkout line, I realized I was whistling quietly to myself, a habit I hadn't had in ages. Back home, I made a simple dinner and ate it in front of the news. Life, it turned out, kept going even when one wedding didn't happen. Before bed, I opened the closet and pulled out another cardigan, one my mother had knitted for me years earlier, one I'd carefully packed away and never worn. I put it on and stood in front of the mirror. Cream-colored, imperfect stitching, incredibly warm. "Mom," I said quietly, "Harper's doing okay." The woman looking back at me in that mirror had no exhaustion in her face, no fear. Only the particular calm of someone who has survived a storm and knows exactly what she wants now. 3 days after the wedding was called off, exactly what I'd expected finally arrived. Not as a direct confrontation, but as whispers, sideways glances, and questions phrased like idle curiosity that were, in fact, sharp as needles. That morning, before I'd even settled fully into my desk, a coworker from the next cubicle leaned over, her voice a careful blend of curiosity and hesitation. "Harper, I heard you had some kind of trouble over the weekend." I looked up and smiled, calm as still water. "I called off my wedding." Her eyes went wide. "Seriously? Why so suddenly?" "We weren't as compatible as I thought," I said. "That's the whole story." She was quiet a moment, then nodded slowly. "Well, marriage is a lifetime decision, I suppose." She went back to her desk, and I knew, without a doubt, this wasn't the last version of that conversation I'd have that week. At lunch, a message arrived from an old acquaintance who'd attended one of Grant's family gatherings a couple of years back. "Harper, I heard you called off the wedding because Grant wasn't wealthy enough. Is that true?" I read it and laughed out loud. Not from joy, but from a kind of tired familiarity with how easily blame gets reassigned. I replied with a single line, "That's not even close to what actually happened." Then I set the phone down and offered nothing more. No debate, no defense. That evening, Corinne called. "They've started spreading a story about you," she said plainly. "That you looked down on Grant for his income, that your demands were unreasonable." I stood by my window, watching the after-work crowd move down the sidewalk below. "I know, Aunt Corinne. Do you want me to say anything publicly?" I shook my head, even though she couldn't see it. "Not yet. I have no interest in explaining myself or arguing with anyone." "Are you sure you've thought this through?" "Yes. The people who trust me don't need an explanation, and the people who don't trust me were never going to believe one anyway." Corinne sighed, but it sounded almost fond. "You are exactly like your mother, you know that?" I smiled. My mom used to say the same thing about herself years ago, whenever someone misjudged her. The days that followed carried rumors that spread faster than I would have thought possible for a private life like mine. Some people asked indirectly. Others just went quiet around me, kept a polite distance. I chose the only response that made sense to me, living exactly as I would have anyway. I showed up on time, focused on my work, ran meetings, wrote reports, planned new projects, as if none of it had happened. In the evenings, I cooked, read, took long walks. My life didn't derail just because a rumor was circulating about it. Some nights, alone, I'd wonder whether I should just put out some kind of statement, get ahead of the story. And then I'd remember Pamela's voice through that door, Brooke's giggling plans, that cold 3-minute recording sitting in an evidence folder now instead of my purse, and the urge would pass. My silence wasn't weakness. It was the last piece of dignity I had left, and I wasn't going to spend it defending myself to strangers. One evening, a call came in from an unfamiliar number. I recognized the voice the second he spoke. "Harper, it's Grant." He sounded exhausted. "I just want to ask you one thing. Did you ever actually love me?" I leaned back in my chair, watching the yellow glow of my desk lamp reflect off the wall. I loved you, I said, and meant it, calmly. Then why were you so heartless about all of it? I wasn't heartless, I said. I just can't love blindly. Not anymore. Silence on his end. I'm only now realizing how badly I let this go, he said quietly. Whether it was a mistake or not, I said. It doesn't really matter now. Isn't there any chance you'd give me one more shot? I shook my head, even though he couldn't see it. Some doors, once you close them, only cause more pain if you try to force them back open. He said nothing else. The call ended in total silence. That night I wasn't sad exactly, and I didn't feel victorious either. Just a quiet emptiness that, almost immediately, began filling itself back up with something steadier. A few days later, Corinne called with an update. They've agreed to repay everything in 3 installments, she said. A few thousand each. The first arrives next week. Thank you so much, Aunt Corinne, I said. Do you want me to meet them to sign anything? No, I said immediately. You represent me. I don't need to be in a room with them. Understood. After we hung up, I stood by the window for a long while, watching the city start to light up as evening settled in. Everything kept functioning around me regardless of anyone's private disaster. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't fully noticed until then. Since the night I called off the wedding, I hadn't cried once over losing Grant. I'd cried only for the version of myself who had trusted so completely, so foolishly. And once I let that version of myself go, the tears simply stopped coming. If someone asked whether the gossip hurt, I'd say yes, honestly. But it was nowhere near strong enough to pull me back to a place I never should have stayed in the first place. I opened the closet and looked at the boxed wedding dress but didn't open it. I wasn't ready yet. Everything takes its own time, even letting go. I sat on the bed, opened a notebook, and wrote one line. Silence doesn't mean weakness. It means you've stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. That week passed slowly, almost deliberately, as if the city itself had decided to let me catch my breath. Mornings to work, evenings home, the same path every day. And along that path I started to notice something changing quietly inside me. The anxiety that used to sit permanently in my chest had thinned out into something calmer. A cleared-out space, like a room finally emptied of years of clutter nobody needed anymore. On a Friday afternoon, just as I was wrapping up a report, my phone buzzed with a banking notification. Deposit of $3,600 received. I stared at the words. I didn't cheer, didn't sigh with relief the way I expected to. I just felt something like solid ground reappearing under my feet, a brick sliding back into its proper place in a wall. A minute later, Corinne called. First installment's in your account. They didn't dare delay it. Thank you, I said. How do you feel? She asked. I thought about it honestly. Normal. She laughed quietly. Good. Normal means they've finally stopped suffocating you, along with their money. That evening, back in my apartment, I opened my banking app just to look at the number, not to obsess over it, but to confirm to myself that stability was returning. I thought about all the times over the years I'd sent Grant money, over dinner, in the middle of a meeting, once at 2 a.m. after reading a panicked message about a family emergency. Each time I told myself it was for peace of mind, that helping people you love is noble. And underneath all of it, quietly, a suppressed unease I'd chosen not to look at directly. I didn't have to ignore it anymore. I pulled the white box holding the wedding dress out of the closet, set it on the bed, and finally opened the lid. You know, I said softly, like I was talking to a friend, some things are just beautiful. It's a shame they were never meant to be kept. The dress lay there, immaculate, not a single crease. I ran my fingers over the tulle. It was cool to the touch. The old ache had gone quiet. What was left was a bittersweet kind of nostalgia for a future that had never really existed outside my own imagination. I closed the box again, still not sure exactly what I'd do with it, but certain that whenever I finally decided, there would be no hesitation left in me. Chloe Brooke texted a few days later. Harper, here's confirmation for the first payment. We're sorry about everything. I read it, sat with it for a moment, then typed back. Paying back what you owe isn't a favor to me. It's your obligation. I sent it, blocked her number, and closed that door for good. Over the following weekend, I did a total clean out of the apartment. Closets, drawers, old boxes I'd been meaning to sort for years. It wasn't about tidiness. It was about clearing out the last remnants of a life I'd spent 5 years quietly assembling for someone else's benefit. Everything I threw into the garbage bag felt like it lifted some invisible weight off my shoulders. In the middle of it, tucked in an old shelf, I found a photograph. Grant and me on our first trip together, up near Mount Rainier, hair wind-blown and messy, both of us laughing at something I couldn't remember anymore. I didn't feel rage looking at it, just a quiet pity. For both of us, so certain back then of a flawless future neither of us had actually earned yet. I put the photo in an envelope, tucked it into the bottom of a drawer, and left it there. Erasing it felt unnecessary. All I needed to do was cut the thread connecting it to my present. That evening, sitting on my tiny balcony with a cup of tea, listening to kids playing somewhere below and the ordinary hum of the city, I felt something close to resurrection. The particular relief of being free from an obligation I'd never actually agreed to in the first place. Not really. A month after I walked away from a wedding that had never been anything but a well-dressed transaction, I understood that the wound in my chest wasn't going to heal through avoidance. It was going to heal through the simple, unglamorous discipline of no longer entertaining illusions. Life didn't get smaller after the dress came out of my closet for the last time. It got fuller, in a way I hadn't expected. Once the constant background noise of an engagement, the vendor calls, the seating charts, the endless managing of other people's expectations, finally stopped, I could see the road ahead of me clearly for what felt like the first time in years. At the office, a project my team had been buried in for nearly 3 months was due for a year-end presentation to the board. In the frenzy of wedding planning, I'd quietly planned to hand the presentation off to a colleague, as a favor to whoever was about to become the head of our household. Looking back now, that plan drew a small, faintly mocking smile out of me, a reminder of just how far I'd been willing to shrink myself out of fear of losing something that was never really mine to lose. My director looked around the table on Monday morning. Harper, the board presentation is yours to lead. Understood, I said, meeting his eyes without a flicker of hesitation. The presentation went smoothly. Not a single stumble, not a moment of doubt even under the sharpest questions from the board. My supervisor gave my shoulder a quiet, approving pat afterward. Excellent work, Harper. Just doing my job, I said, though privately I felt something closer to pride. Not just at keeping my position, but at reclaiming a version of myself I'd nearly let disappear. Over lunch, a senior manager turned to me. Harper, word is, your personal life's had some turbulence lately. I kept eating, unbothered, then looked up with a small smile. I got a lesson in hitting the brakes before a serious derailment. I managed to save what mattered, right in time. She lowered her gaze for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Hitting the brakes on your own fear takes more nerve than most people realize until they've had to do it themselves. That evening, Corinne texted, Final installment confirmed. The case is officially closed. You're free. I read it without any dramatic surge of feeling, just lightness. Good, Aunt Corinne, I texted back. Thank you for everything. That same evening, an unusual impulse pulled me toward the phone. Local charities occasionally called our office looking for donations, and one message had stayed with me all week: a nonprofit collecting formal wear for brides who couldn't otherwise afford one. I sat with it for a moment, then made the call myself. The volunteer's voice on the other end was gentle, unhurried, with none of the pushy insistence I half expected. I hung up, and something in my chest settled. A quiet agreement with myself that the decision had finally, fully arrived. I lifted the wedding dress out of its box one last time. The fabric was still flawless, still catching the light the exact same way it had the day I bought it. I felt one small, sharp pang. Not regret, exactly, but a kind of mourning for a future version of myself who never got to exist. Then it passed. I folded the dress carefully into a garment bag and tucked a short note into the fold. This is a new dress. I never got to wear it. I hope it brings someone else happiness. I didn't sign it. The volunteer at the foundation's door looked at the dress, then at me, clearly stunned by its condition. "This is beautiful. Are you sure you want to give this away? It must have cost a fortune." "It did," I said, my smile widening slightly. "But I lost the reason to wear it. And honestly, I've gained something more solid to carry with me instead." She nodded, visibly moved, a little shine in her eyes. Standing outside under the city lights afterward, I felt an odd, weightless clarity, the kind that comes after you finally let go of something you were never going to use anyway. That night, a close friend texted after I mentioned what I'd done. "You just gave away thousands of dollars of silk to a total stranger to erase the past? You have serious guts, Harper. I'm proud of you." I smiled, typing back under the glow of my screen, agreeing to a weekend trip to the coast she'd been trying to get me to commit to for weeks. Looking out my dark window, the outline of the last 5 years slowly lost its sharp edges in my mind. It wasn't that I felt triumphant, or somehow better than anyone. The only thing that had pushed me to finally face the truth was my own mistake catching up with me. And somewhere underneath the fear, a dormant instinct to fight for my own future had simply woken back up right on time. About 2 weeks after the last installment cleared, I found myself thinking, more and more, about the years before Grant. About my mother's small rented house near the water, the corner store 2 blocks down that had been there since before I was born, the woman who used to keep an eye on things when my mother traveled for work. Her name was Mrs. Alvarez, and she'd been my mother's neighbor for almost 15 years. I hadn't spoken to her in months. Since the funeral, really, if I was being honest with myself. One evening, sitting on my balcony with a cup of tea going cold beside me, I finally picked up the phone and called her. "Harper, sweetheart, it's been ages," she said, her voice warm and immediately familiar, like no time had passed at all. "How are you doing, honey?" "I'm okay, Mrs. Alvarez," I said. "I actually had a question. I know Mom sometimes left things with you for safekeeping. Is there anything of hers still around?" There was a pause on the line, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "There is, actually," she said finally. "There's a canvas bag. She left it with me not long before she passed. Told me to hang on to it. Said you'd come asking eventually." Something tightened in my throat. "I understand. I'll come by this weekend if that's all right." "Of course, dear. I'll have it ready." That Saturday, I drove out to the old neighborhood for the first time in what felt like years. The street looked mostly the same, a little more worn, a new owner behind the counter at the corner store, but the same crooked mailbox on the corner, the same crack in the sidewalk I used to jump over as a kid on my way home from school. Mrs. Alvarez handed me a faded light blue canvas bag, heavier than I expected. Inside were a handful of old photographs, a worn spiral notebook, and a thin envelope tucked between the pages. I opened the notebook first. My mother's handwriting, slanted and familiar, filled the first page. "Harper, my girl. If you're reading this, it means I'm no longer beside you. Don't be sad about that. All I ever wanted was for you to live your life well, for yourself. Not for anyone else's comfort. Not for anyone else's approval. Just for you. I stood there in Mrs. Alvarez's small living room for a long time, not moving, not speaking. Those words weren't asking me to sacrifice anything. They weren't asking for patience or self-denial or quiet endurance. They were asking for exactly one thing, that I actually live, on my own terms, for myself. On the drive back, I found myself pulling into the parking lot of my Ballard condo instead of heading straight home, the place that had never once been touched by a single member of Grant's family, the place that still smelled faintly of fresh paint and untouched possibility. I let myself in, stood in the middle of the empty living room, sunlight pouring through the big windows, and laughed out loud, alone, into all that silence. At least you didn't lose the roof over your head, I said to myself. That evening, I called my closest friend, Naomi. Next weekend, I'm moving into my place in Ballard, I told her, with more certainty in my voice than I'd expected. Wait, are you sure you're ready for that? Are you doing okay? Better than I thought I'd be, I said honestly. Okay, I'm coming to help with boxes, no arguments. That first night in the condo, I slept on a mattress on the bare living room floor. No furniture yet, no curtains, nothing but the underfloor heating humming quietly beneath me, and the enormous disorienting fact that I was finally, entirely, in a home of my own. I fell asleep almost instantly, with a kind of deep, unguarded peace I hadn't felt in years. The next morning, a banking notification woke me before my alarm did. The final installment from Grant's family had cleared. I looked at it for a moment, then set the phone down, feeling mostly indifference. I had no more appetite left for replaying the past, no more curiosity about a family that had only ever seen me as a convenient, renewable resource. I was, for the first time in longer than I could easily remember, simply free. No more what-ifs circling my head at 3 a.m. Just one certainty, solid and unshakable. I had chosen well in the end, even if it had taken me 5 years and one overheard conversation to get there. I made coffee and stepped out onto the small terrace, watching the city wake up below me, admiring a life that finally belonged only to me, free of obligation, free of performed gratitude, free of the false embrace of a family that had never actually been mine. Over the following 2 weeks, I settled slowly into the larger, unfamiliar space. Morning light would slide across the hardwood floors through the big terrace windows, casting long shadows that felt, somehow, like an invitation rather than an emptiness. This new solitude wasn't loneliness. It was a formula I got to rebuild, fresh, every single day, entirely on my own terms. The simple act of breathing without needing to report my whereabouts to anyone, without the low hum of being constantly monitored, lightened something in my chest I hadn't even realized had been weighing on me for years. The first few nights, I noticed a kind of dissonance that made falling asleep harder than it should have been. But it wasn't grief. It was the unfamiliar quiet of a space that existed purely for my own life, with no higher authority dictating its rhythm. Once I adjusted, my breath, as my head hit the pillow each night, started marking the clean end of the day's noise instead of the beginning of another restless spiral about doorsteps and phantom in-laws. At work, the daily grind of reports and deadlines folded back into ordinary life, no longer orbiting the invisible narrative of a jilted woman starting over. A new project sharpened my focus in a way that felt good, almost athletic. Around the same time, I was called into the director's office with a proposal. "Harper," the general director began, watching me carefully. "The boards discussed it, and they see you as the right person to head this up. It'll take a lot out of you, but it comes with real career growth. Travel, better compensation, the whole package. Are you ready to take the wheel on this? I am, I said, my voice steady and immediate. He gave a short nod, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, clearly already confident in my answer. My heart pounded with something I hadn't felt in a long time, genuine excitement about my own future, unclouded by anyone else's expectations. The old version of me would have spent the walk back to my desk quietly worrying about what Grant and Pamela would think. Would they resent my ambition? Call me selfish, cold, too focused on career over family? That question, I realized with something close to relief, no longer had any right to exist in my head at all. That weekend, Naomi came over to help assemble furniture. Sitting cross-legged on the floor with a screwdriver in hand, she looked up at me and said, "You know what, Harper? You look like you dropped about 100 pounds off your shoulders. Genuinely." "Because I did," I said, laughing. "My whole life I thought I had to fit myself into someone else's shape to earn their love. Turns out it's enough just to be in harmony with myself." That Sunday afternoon, I drove out to the cemetery. I laid a bouquet of white chrysanthemums against my mother's headstone, the cool wind moving gently through the trees overhead. "I'm doing okay, Mom," I whispered. "I understood the lesson. I won't let anyone use me like that again. I won't sacrifice myself for people who only ever saw dollar signs behind the word family." The wind picked up slightly, rustling the branches above, and it felt, in that irrational, comforting way grief sometimes lets you believe things, like her quiet approval. One Friday evening at the start of winter, I stopped into my favorite coffee shop on the ground floor of my office building to work through a few slides before heading home. Ordinary evening, soft jazz playing somewhere in the background, until a familiar voice said my name. "Harper." I looked up. Grant was standing near my table, thinner than I remembered, in a dark jacket, his expression a mix of surprise and something more hesitant. I braced for a flicker of the old discomfort, but instead felt only a calm, complete indifference. "Hi," I said, with a polite nod. He hesitated, then pulled out the chair across from me and sat down, keeping a careful distance. "I didn't expect to run into you here." "I come here sometimes," I said. "It's near the office." The air between us wasn't tense exactly, but it wasn't familiar either. It felt like two people who used to know each other completely, now sitting across from each other as near strangers who happened to share a past. "You look different," he said, lighter, calmer. I smiled. "Maybe because I'm not forcing myself into anything anymore." He looked down at the cup in front of him, turning it slowly. "I've thought a lot about everything that happened. I'm sorry I didn't protect you, that I let it get that far." I looked at him for a long moment, not to weigh whether I could forgive him, but to check on something more important. Did his words still have any power over me at all? "Grant," I said slowly, "it's your right to apologize. Whether I have any obligation to sit here and accept it is entirely my own." He blinked, a little thrown. "I don't expect you to come back. I just wanted to say it." "I understand," I said, nodding. "I heard you." When I left the coffee shop a few minutes later, he didn't try to stop me. The cold air hit the back of my neck as I stepped outside. I pulled my collar up and walked slowly down the sidewalk, feeling, with total clarity, that a particular chapter of my life had finally, completely, closed. After calling off the wedding, I made a conscious decision not to spend my days asking why this had happened to me. Instead, I started asking myself a much more useful question. What was I going to do with myself now that I finally had the chance to actually answer it? A work trip to a training seminar in Denver, a few months later, ended up teaching me more than any of the conference material itself. The room was full of women of every age and background, some divorced, some single by choice, some married for decades to partners who clearly adored them. What struck me, sitting in the back row with a lukewarm coffee, was that not one of them measured her own worth by whether or not she had a ring on her finger. Their confidence came from somewhere else entirely. Their work, their friendships, the quiet, private knowledge of exactly what they were capable of on their own. I came home from that trip and started a new habit almost immediately. Once a month, I blocked off an entire day just for myself. No phone notifications, no work emails, no friends dropping by unannounced. Just a good book, a slow breakfast, and usually something in the kitchen that took longer to cook than it strictly needed to, because for once, I had nowhere else to be. One of those evenings, Naomi sat on my living room floor, leaning against the new couch we'd finally gotten delivered, and asked me, out of nowhere, "Do you ever regret it?" Regret what? Calling off the wedding? I thought about it honestly before answering. No. If I regret anything, it's that I ever let myself doubt my own worth in the first place. I used to be terrified of losing a person, a relationship, an entire imagined future. These days, the only thing that actually scares me is the idea of losing myself again. She was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly, like she was filing that answer away for herself too. I started paying closer attention, in those months, to how I'd actually gotten to that overheard conversation in the first place. Not the specific facts of it, which I already knew by heart, but the pattern underneath it. How many small warning signs I'd talked myself out of over 5 years. The way Pamela's compliments always seemed to arrive right before a request for money. The way Grant would go quiet, almost sheepish, whenever I brought up anything involving the deed to a property. As if the conversation embarrassed him more than it should have if his intentions had ever actually been what he claimed. None of it had been invisible. I'd simply chosen, over and over, not to look directly at it. Because looking directly at it would have meant admitting I'd built 5 years of my life on a foundation that was never actually solid. I started reading more seriously about financial independence that winter. Not out of anxiety, but out of a kind of hunger to understand, fully, what my mother had spent her whole life quietly practicing without ever explaining the theory behind it. I opened a retirement account I should have opened years earlier. I met with a financial advisor Corinne recommended, a blunt, no-nonsense woman named Patricia who looked at my spreadsheet of the last 5 years of loans to Grant's family and simply said, "Well, at least you have the receipts. Most people don't even have that." I laughed and told her the whole story, condensed into 3 sentences. She didn't look shocked. She'd apparently heard some version of it more times than she could count. "The pattern's almost always the same," she told me. Somebody convinces a smart, generous person that keeping records or asking questions about money is somehow unromantic, ungenerous, distrustful. And that same somebody is always, without fail, the one who benefits most from you, never asking. I thought about that for a long time afterward. I'd been so careful, my whole adult life, about my career, my savings, the decisions that were entirely mine to make. And then, the moment a ring and a wedding date entered the picture, I'd quietly, almost without noticing, started making an exception for exactly the people who least deserved one. The canvas bag Mrs. Alvarez had kept for me sat on my bookshelf for weeks before I worked up the nerve to go through the rest of it properly. Not just the letter, which I'd already read a dozen times by then, but the old photographs and the rest of the notebook underneath it. My mother had grown up in a small town outside Spokane, the oldest of 4 kids, in a house where money was tight and nobody talked about it directly. She'd told me pieces of this over the years, usually in passing, never as a lesson, just as fact. What I hadn't known until I read further into that spiral notebook was how young she'd been when she started working. 16, cleaning offices after school, saving nearly everything she made in a coffee can hidden under a floorboard, because her own stepfather had a habit of borrowing from anyone in the house who kept cash anywhere he could find it. She wrote about the exact year she'd finally opened her first bank account, in her own name, at 19, and how it had felt like the first real door she'd ever locked behind herself. She wrote about my father, who I barely remembered, and about the quiet, unglamorous years after he left, when she worked 2 jobs and never once, as far as I could tell from her handwriting, let herself feel sorry for the situation for longer than an evening at a time. Reading it, I understood something about her that I'd never quite had language for while she was alive. She hadn't been naturally suspicious of people, or cold, or overly protective out of some inherited paranoia. She'd built her caution the hard way, brick by brick, out of a childhood where she'd learned early exactly what happens to a woman who doesn't keep careful track of her own resources. Every warning she'd given me, keep this money safe, don't tell his family, learn to be strong, hadn't come from nowhere. It had come from a life I'd only ever seen the smoothed-over, adult version of. I found one more page near the back of the notebook, dated only a few months before she got sick. It read, simply, "Harper doesn't know how hard I worked to make her childhood look easy. I hope she never has to learn the hard way what I learned. But if she does, I hope she remembers she comes from a long line of women who got back up." I sat with that notebook open on my lap for a long time that evening, in my quiet condo, with the city lights just starting to come on outside the window. I understood, more clearly than I ever had before, that the woman who raised me hadn't simply gotten lucky, or been naturally strong. She had built her strength on purpose, out of necessity, the same way I was now building mine. Winter turned into spring in Seattle the way it always does, reluctantly, in fits and starts, gray days interrupted by sudden, almost aggressive bursts of sunshine that made the whole city seem momentarily surprised by its own good luck. My life, by then, had settled into a rhythm I didn't recognize from before. Not because it was dramatic or eventful, but because, for the first time in years, it belonged entirely to me. Work kept expanding in satisfying ways. The project I'd taken over that winter wrapped successfully, ahead of schedule, and led to another promotion by early summer. A title with more responsibility, a better office, actual say in decisions that used to happen entirely above my head. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I was good at this. Not just competent. Good, in the way that comes from finally having enough bandwidth to actually care about the work instead of managing a second invisible job of emotional damage control at home. I started dating again, eventually, though slowly and with a wariness that had nothing to do with cynicism and everything to do with simple pattern recognition. I notice things now that I never used to notice before, how someone talked about their own family, whether they asked easy, casual questions about my finances a little too early, whether their compliments seemed to arrive right before a favor. It wasn't paranoia. It was information, and I finally knew how to use it. Naomi and I took that coastal trip we'd talked about, and a few more after that. We hiked, badly, laughing most of the way up a trail neither of us had properly researched beforehand. I reconnected with a few old college friends I'd let drift during the Grant years, mostly because keeping the peace with his family had quietly taken up more of my social energy than I'd ever noticed at the time. It turned out most of those friendships had simply been waiting, patiently, for me to have room for them again. I kept my monthly day of total solitude, and it slowly became one of my favorite parts of the month rather than something I had to remind myself to protect. I started painting, badly at first, then a little less badly. Mostly landscapes of the water near my mother's old neighborhood, the corner store, the crooked mailbox I used to jump over as a kid. I framed one of them and hung it in the entryway of my condo, right where I'd see it every time I came home. Corinne and I stayed close. She became something between a mentor and an honorary aunt, the kind of steady presence I hadn't realized how badly I needed until she was already there. We had dinner every few weeks, and she never once brought up Grant or his family unless I did first, which, as time went on, became less and less often. I thought about my mother constantly, but differently than I had in the raw months right after she passed. Less as a source of grief, more as a kind of ongoing conversation. I found myself, more than once, standing in the condo she never got to see, saying things out loud to an empty room, the way you might talk to someone on a long car ride. "I think you'd like this place, Mom. I think you'd have opinions about the paint color in the kitchen. I think you'd be proud, even if you'd never say it in so many words." If you've followed me this far into my story, maybe you already know how this feels. That particular tightness in your chest when someone else's dishonesty finally becomes impossible to unsee. Maybe you felt anger reading this. Maybe sympathy. Maybe a strange, guilty relief, the kind that comes from recognizing a pattern in someone else's story that you've been quietly avoiding in your own. I want to be honest with you about something. For a long time after everything happened, I worried that telling this story, even anonymously, even years later, made me look bitter, or vindictive, or like a woman who couldn't let go of a grudge. I want to say clearly that none of this was ever about revenge. I never once wanted to burn Grant's family down publicly, drag their names through the mud, humiliate them the way they'd tried, so casually, to humiliate me. I only ever wanted one thing, to get my own life back, cleanly, with as little residue left on it as possible. That's the part I think doesn't always come through in stories like this one. It's not really about the villain. It's about the moment the person telling the story finally, fully, believes she deserves better, and then does something about that belief instead of just feeling it quietly, alone, at 2 in the morning. If any part of this resonates with you, if there's a version of Pamela's voice through a door somewhere in your own life, a version of a condo or a savings account or a career you've quietly let someone else plan to absorb, I hope you take it as permission to look directly at whatever you've been avoiding, not out of paranoia, out of respect for yourself. I'll keep going. There's more to tell you. But I wanted to pause here and say that clearly, in case it got lost in everything that came before or after it. Looking back on those 5 years with Grant now, from the distance of an apartment and a life he never gets to enter, I can see the signs so clearly it almost embarrasses me. Not because they were subtle, because I was the one who kept deciding over and over not to look directly at them. There was the time, about 2 years in, when Pamela had insisted on helping plan a surprise birthday dinner for me, only to spend most of the evening subtly steering the conversation toward how expensive my job clearly must be, how nice it must be to never worry about money the way real families did. I remember laughing it off at the time, chalking it up to an older woman's occasional tactlessness. I didn't clock, until much later, that she'd asked, almost offhandedly, what my mother's business had actually been worth before she retired. There was the time Grant had brought up, very casually, over dinner, whether it might make more sense to eventually put both our names on the Ballard condo, for tax reasons. A suggestion that sounded reasonable enough on its surface that I'd actually looked into it, before ultimately deciding to wait until after the wedding, mostly out of a vague, unexamined sense that changing it before we were legally married would be somehow presumptuous of him. I understand now that the presumption ran entirely the other direction. There was Brooke's habit, which I'd always found endearing at the time, of asking detailed questions about my career trajectory, my salary bracket, how project managers at my level typically got promoted. I'd assumed, generously, that she genuinely wanted to follow in my footsteps. It never once occurred to me that she might simply be doing careful, patient research. None of these moments, on their own, would have told me anything definitive. That's what makes this particular kind of dishonesty so effective. It never announces itself in a single dramatic scene. It accumulates, quietly, across hundreds of small, forgettable interactions until one night, entirely by accident, you happen to be standing on the wrong side of a door at exactly the right moment, and the whole pattern finally snaps into focus all at once. I've thought a lot since then about how many women go their entire lives without ever standing on that particular side of that particular door. How many marriages exist for decades on exactly the foundation mine almost did, with nobody ever accidentally overhearing the truth, the arrangement simply hardening generation after generation into just how families work. I don't say this to feel superior to anyone. I say it because I think the actual lesson of my story isn't really about Grant or Pamela or Brooke specifically. It's about the fact that I had every single piece of information I needed, scattered across 5 years, and simply chose, again and again, not to assemble it. Because assembling it would have meant admitting that the life I was building might not be the one I thought it was. A year after the wedding that never happened, I stood in my kitchen in Ballard on a Saturday morning, coffee in hand, looking out at a view I still hadn't fully gotten used to owning outright. The condo finally looked like a home instead of a project. Furniture that actually matched, my own paintings on the walls, a bookshelf that had slowly filled up with everything I'd read that year, including, tucked near the end of one shelf, my mother's canvas bag, still exactly where I'd first put it. Naomi came over that afternoon with a bottle of wine and news of her own. She was getting married in the spring to a man named Theo who I genuinely liked, who asked thoughtful questions and never once, in the 18 months I'd known him, asked me a single question about my finances that felt anything other than ordinary curiosity. "You'll come to the wedding, right?" she asked, half joking, half nervous, clearly aware of the irony. "Of course I will," I said, and meant it completely. "Weddings aren't the problem, Naomi. Bad ones are." She laughed, relieved, and we spent the rest of the evening on my little terrace, talking about nothing in particular, the easy kind of conversation that doesn't require either person to perform anything for the other. I'd run into Grant exactly twice more since that evening at the coffee shop. Once at a mutual friend's engagement party I almost didn't attend, once completely by accident at a farmer's market on a Sunday morning. Both times were brief, polite, entirely uneventful. He'd started his own small engineering consultancy, I'd heard, funded modestly, without the windfall his family had once imagined a sold condo would provide. I found I genuinely hoped it went well for him. Not because I still cared for him in any romantic sense, but because I'd stopped needing his failure to validate my own decision. My decision had already validated itself, every single ordinary day since I made it. Pamela and Brooke, as far as I knew, had moved to a different part of the state not long after everything settled. I never heard from either of them again, and I never once went looking. Corinne and I still had dinner most months. She'd started, half-jokingly, introducing me to people as my other niece, which I'd stopped correcting a long time ago because it had simply become true. I thought, that afternoon on the terrace with Naomi, about the woman I'd been a year earlier, sitting frozen in a hallway, one finger hovering over a doorbell, trying to decide whether to press it. I thought about how close I'd come, on so many ordinary evenings before that one, to never overhearing anything at all. How easily this entire story could have gone the other way, quietly, invisibly, for the rest of my life. I didn't feel lucky exactly. Luck felt like too small a word for it. What I felt was something closer to gratitude for the ajar door, for the 3 cold minutes of recording, for a mother who'd spent her whole life quietly teaching me, without ever fully explaining why, exactly how to recognize the moment I needed to save myself. My story doesn't end with a lavish wedding, or a dramatic public reckoning, or some satisfying scene where Grant's family gets exactly what they deserve in front of an audience. It ends, quietly, with a woman standing on her own terrace a year later, entirely at peace with an ordinary life she built herself, one careful decision at a time. As someone who canceled her own wedding the night before it was supposed to happen, and somehow saved her own life in the process, I want to leave something behind for anyone reading this who might be standing right now at the edge of a decision that feels too big, too late, too humiliating to reverse. Love, on its own, was never going to be enough. Not without respect, not without transparency, not without the basic, unglamorous sense of safety that lets you fall asleep at night without quietly wondering what's being decided about your future in a room you're not in. Don't compromise out of fear of your own age, of loneliness, of what people might whisper about you at a family gathering next Thanksgiving. Those fears are real, and I don't want to pretend they aren't. But they are, in the end, temporary and survivable in a way that a lifetime spent as someone else's resource is not. Learn to keep your own records, financial and otherwise, not out of suspicion, but out of self-respect. Someone who genuinely loves you will never once ask you to stop doing that. If you ever find yourself standing outside a door, hand hovering over a bell, hearing something you weren't supposed to hear, trust that instinct completely. Don't talk yourself back into the version of the story where none of it mattered. It mattered. It's supposed to matter. I never got my mother's cardigan back. I think about that sometimes. That soft gray sweater with the small embroidered flowers, still sitting somewhere in an apartment I'll never set foot in again, if it's even still there at all. For a long time, I thought losing it was the price I paid for everything else I got to keep. Lately, I've started thinking about it differently. I think she'd tell me the cardigan was never really the point. I think she'd say the flowers were only ever a reminder, and I don't need the fabric anymore to remember what they meant. Peace. Safety. I found my way to both of those eventually, on my own terms, in a home with my name on the deed and no one else's fingerprints anywhere on the decision. If that's the only inheritance I ever get to hand down to anyone else someday, I think it might be enough. I haven't told you much yet about the year my mother was sick, and I think, looking back, that year explains more about what happened later than almost anything else in this story. She was diagnosed in early spring, the kind of diagnosis that comes with a timeline attached to it almost immediately, delivered by a doctor who was kind but not falsely optimistic. I remember sitting in the parking garage afterward in my car, unable to make myself turn the key for almost 20 minutes. My mother sitting quietly beside me with her hands folded in her lap, somehow calmer than I was. "Don't do that," she said finally, nodding toward my white knuckles on the steering wheel. "Not yet. We've got time to fall apart later. Right now, I want lunch." That was so entirely her. She spent the better part of that year handling her own decline with a kind of brisk, almost business-like efficiency that used to frustrate me at the time, arranging her paperwork, quietly transferring things into my name well before anyone suggested she needed to. having conversations with lawyers and accountants that she never fully explained to me until much later, if at all. Grant was around for parts of that year, and to be fair to him, he wasn't cruel about it. He came to a handful of appointments with me. He sat in waiting rooms. Pamela sent flowers twice, with cards signed in a looping, sympathetic hand that I remember finding genuinely touching at the time. I understand now that grief has a way of making people extend you the benefit of the doubt on almost everything, including people who don't deserve nearly as much benefit as you're prepared to give them. Near the end, my mother stopped pretending to be as strong as she'd been performing all year. There was a week, maybe 10 days, where she barely spoke, where most of what passed between us happened in the quiet, wordless language of just being in the same room. And then there was the day she asked me to help her into her favorite chair by the window and asked for the cardigan. "Not to wear," she said when I looked confused. "I'm not finished with it yet. Bring me my sewing basket." I sat with her for the better part of that afternoon while she worked on the collar of that gray cardigan with hands that had gone thin and unsteady, stitching 2 small flowers along the edge with a patience that, even then, even as sick as she was, never once wavered. I asked her what they meant. "Peace," she said, without looking up, "and safety. That's all I ever really wanted for you, baby. I don't care about weddings or houses or any of that, not really. I just want you safe, and I want you at peace. If you ever have to choose between the two of those and something that looks nicer on paper, choose peace and safety every single time. Promise me that." I promised her, the way you promise a dying woman almost anything, without fully understanding yet what the promise would eventually cost me, or what it would eventually save me from. She died 6 weeks later, on a cold night in early winter, in a hospital room with a window that looked out over a parking lot instead of anything worth looking at. I held her hand until it stopped being warm. I don't think I've ever told anyone, not even Naomi, exactly how long I sat there afterward before I let a nurse come in. I think about that promise almost every day now. I think it's the reason I was able to stand frozen outside that apartment door, hand hovering over a bell, and somehow still hear, underneath Pamela's honeyed voice and Brooke's giggling, my mother's much quieter voice from a year earlier, telling me exactly which of the 2 options mattered more. I want to tell you about the proposal, too, because I think it matters, in hindsight, exactly how convincing all of it was. This wasn't a man who was careless or obviously insincere. Whatever else turned out to be true about Grant, or about the family that raised him, the performance itself had been, for 5 years, genuinely good. He proposed on a weekend trip to Chelan, at a small overlook above the lake that we'd found completely by accident on a hike the summer before. The kind of spot you stumble onto and quietly agree, without saying it out loud, to come back to someday. He'd clearly planned it meticulously. A bottle of wine chilled in a cooler he'd somehow carried up the trail without me noticing. A ring that had belonged, he told me, to his grandmother, resized weeks earlier without my knowledge at a jeweler 2 towns over so I wouldn't stumble onto the receipt. I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence, laughing, crying a little, genuinely happy in a way I don't regret feeling, even now, even knowing everything I know. That happiness was real. It just turned out to be built on a foundation I hadn't been allowed to properly inspect. The engagement party 3 weeks later was at Pamela's apartment, the same one I'd eventually stand outside of with a phone recording quietly running. She'd made a toast that night that I used to think about often in the years afterward, before I understood what it actually meant. "To Harper," she'd said, raising her glass, her eyes shining with what I took, at the time, for genuine emotion, "who found her way into this family exactly when we needed her most." I remember thinking at the time that it was one of the kindest things anyone had ever said about me. I understand now that it was, in its own way, entirely honest. They had needed me, just not for the reasons I imagined. Grant's father had passed away when he was a teenager, something he'd told me early in our relationship with a rawness that made me feel trusted, chosen, led into something private. I believed for 5 years that this shared loss between us, his father, my mother, eventually, was part of what made our connection feel so solid. Looking back now, I wonder how much of that early vulnerability had been genuine grief, and how much of it had simply been an effective way to fast-track intimacy with a woman his family had, perhaps, already identified as useful before I'd even fully realized I was being courted. I don't say any of this to suggest Grant never loved me at all. I think, in his own limited, complicated way, he probably did, at least some of the time. I think it's entirely possible to love someone and still allow your family to plan, methodically, to take everything she has. Those two things aren't actually as contradictory as I once assumed they were. That, more than anything else, is the piece of this story that took me the longest to make peace with. I mentioned the training seminar in Denver briefly before, but I want to go back and tell you about it properly, because it turned out to be one of the more important weeks of that entire year, even though nothing dramatic happened there at all. It was a standard professional development trip, 3 days of workshops on leadership and negotiation, the kind of conference most people attend half-heartedly, checking email under the table during the slower sessions. I almost didn't go. Corinne had to talk me into it, reminding me that hiding in my condo indefinitely wasn't actually the same thing as healing. The woman I ended up sitting next to during the first session was named Denise, mid-50s, a regional director for a logistics company in Phoenix, divorced twice, entirely unbothered by either fact. During a break, she asked, casually, whether I was married. "Almost," I said, and something in my tone must have given the rest away, because she raised an eyebrow and asked if I wanted to talk about it over coffee instead of sitting through the next panel on conflict resolution. I told her a condensed version of the story, the way you tell something to a stranger you'll likely never see again, freely, without the careful editing I still did around people I actually had to keep seeing afterward. She listened without interrupting, then said something I still think about. "You know what the actual crime was, don't you? It wasn't the money. People try to take money from each other constantly. It's practically the national pastime. The actual crime was that they made you feel like wanting proof of their intentions was somehow rude. That's the tell, every single time. Anybody who makes basic transparency feel like an insult is telling you exactly what they're planning to do with the lack of it." I turned that sentence over in my head for the rest of the conference, and honestly, for most of the following year. The second night, a handful of us from the same session ended up at the hotel bar, and the conversation drifted, unprompted, into a kind of loose round table of women comparing notes on exactly the same theme, from wildly different angles. One woman had walked away from a business partnership with her own sister over almost identical dynamics. Another had spent a decade in a marriage where her husband's family treated every financial conversation as an act of disloyalty, until she finally, quietly, built an entirely separate savings account nobody else knew existed, just in case. Denise, it turned out, had left both of her marriages for reasons that had nothing to do with love running out, and everything to do with the exact moment she'd realized whose interests were actually being protected in each relationship. None of them measured their worth, as far as I could tell,
by whether or not a man currently approved of them. It wasn't coldness. It was something closer to clarity, earned the hard way. The kind you can't really explain to someone who hasn't needed it yet. I flew home from that trip with a different posture than I'd had going into it. Less like a woman recovering from a wound, more like a woman who had just been handed a map she wished she'd had 5 years earlier, but was grateful, finally, to be holding at all. Nobody warns you about this part, but calling off a wedding the day before it happens comes with its own strange, exhausting to-do list, separate entirely from the emotional wreckage. In the middle of everything else, I still had a venue deposit, a photographer, a florist, and a catering contract, all of which existed completely independent of whether Grant's family had been quietly planning to strip me for parts. Corinne handled most of it, thankfully, treating the whole mess with the same brisk efficiency she brought to everything else. The venue, the Fairmont downtown, had a cancellation clause that let us recover about 60% of the deposit given the short notice, which felt, in the moment, like a small, absurd victory in the middle of a much larger one. The florist was surprisingly kind about it. I'd worked with a small, family-run shop in Ballard, and the owner, a woman named Teresa who'd done the flowers for at least a dozen weddings I'd have recognized from friends' social media over the years, told me over the phone that she'd keep the deposit as a credit toward whenever you actually need flowers next, for whatever reason, no rush. I ended up using that credit almost a year later for an entirely unrelated event, my own housewarming party, ironically, in the condo the wedding was never supposed to be for in the first place. The photographer was less understanding, and Corinne had to send a formal letter over a contract dispute that dragged on for almost 2 months before resolving in a modest partial refund. I remember being surprised throughout that whole process by how many of these vendor relationships had quietly become entangled with Grant's family without my fully realizing it. Pamela had insisted on being present for at least 3 of the planning meetings, offering opinions on flower colors and seating charts with an authority that, at the time, I'd read as enthusiasm and now understood as something closer to ownership. The catering company, by far the largest expense, turned out to be the most complicated of all, mostly because Grant's had been the one to sign that particular contract, using an account that, it emerged during the unwinding of everything, had actually been funded partly by one of my own loans to the family months earlier. Corinne handled that negotiation directly with their attorney, and by the time it settled, months later, I'd stopped even tracking the specifics closely. I trusted her completely by then, and honestly, I'd developed a kind of protective numbness around anything involving invoices from that period of my life. The wedding planner I'd hired, a brisk, no-nonsense woman named Adeze, who I genuinely liked working with over the previous year, called me personally the week after everything fell apart, not to discuss logistics, but just to check on me. "I've done this job for 11 years, she told me. "You'd be amazed how often the actual wedding turns out to be the least interesting part of the story. I'm not going to pretend I'm not curious what happened, but I'm also not going to ask, unless you want to tell me." I told her a short, condensed version, mostly out of a strange gratitude for the question being asked gently instead of greedily. She was quiet for a moment after I finished, then said something I've held on to ever since. "For what it's worth, in 11 years, I've never once had a bride regret calling something off before the wedding. I've had plenty regret not calling something off after." I thanked her, and meant it more than she probably realized. Small kindnesses like that, scattered through an otherwise brutal few weeks, ended up mattering more than I expected them to. It's easy, in the middle of a story like mine, to focus entirely on the villains. But there were also a handful of near strangers, a florist offering a no-questions credit, a wedding planner making a single phone call she didn't have to make, who quietly reminded me that most people, given the chance, default to decency rather than opportunism. It was Grant's family who turned out to be the exception, not the rule. And I think that distinction matters more than it sometimes gets credit for in stories like this one. It took me almost a year and a half before I let myself go on a date that felt like more than an obligation to prove to myself I wasn't broken. Naomi set it up, half apologetically, insisting the guy, a structural engineer named Marcus, a friend of Theo's from grad school, had absolutely no idea about any of my history and wouldn't ask about it unless I brought it up myself. We met at a small Italian place in Fremont, close enough to my condo that I could have walked home if the evening had gone badly, which felt, at the time, like an important piece of strategic planning. It didn't go badly. Marcus asked good questions, listened more than he talked, and somewhere around the second course, when the conversation drifted naturally toward past relationships, I gave him the short version. An engagement, called off, complicated family dynamics, without elaborating further, curious whether he'd push. He didn't. He nodded, said something simple like, "That sounds like it took a lot out of you," and let the subject move on naturally from there, without treating my brevity as an invitation to dig. We saw each other for about 4 months after that, casually at first, then with a little more intention. It didn't end dramatically. We simply wanted different things at that particular point in our lives. Him ready to think seriously about settling down, me still, quietly, in the middle of building something with myself that I wasn't ready to fold into someone else's life just yet. We parted on good terms, the kind of ending that doesn't leave scar tissue behind, just a mild, retrospective fondness. What mattered more than the relationship itself, looking back, was what it taught me about my own instincts. Somewhere in those 4 months, I caught myself, unprompted, mentally cataloging small details the way I never used to before. How Marcus talked about his own mother, whether he asked about my finances with genuine curiosity or a slightly too practiced casualness. How he behaved around money in general, splitting bills without ceremony, never once suggesting anything should be handled differently once things got more serious. None of it raised a single flag, and that, in its own quiet way, felt like enormous progress. I'd worried for a long time that I'd become permanently suspicious, unable to trust anyone again without picking apart every gesture for hidden motives. What I found instead, dating Marcus, was something closer to discernment than suspicion. The ability to notice small signals without assuming the worst automatically. To actually relax into an evening instead of quietly auditing it the entire time. I told Corinne about the split, eventually, over one of our regular dinners. She asked if I was sad about it. A little, I admitted, but not in the way I would have been a year and a half ago. It doesn't feel like losing anything. It just feels like a chapter that ran its course. She smiled at that, the particular smile she reserved for moments when she thought I'd finally absorbed a lesson she'd been trying to teach me without lecturing me about it directly. That, she said, is the whole ballgame, Harper. Being able to let something end without it costing you your peace. Most people never get there. If you've read this whole story, every chapter, every small detour into my mother's life, or a stranger's kindness at a coffee shop, or a lawyer's blunt advice at my kitchen table, I want to thank you, genuinely, for sticking with me through all of it. Stories like mine don't always get told in full. Usually we only hear the highlight reel, the dramatic reveal behind the door, the satisfying moment the villain gets caught. I wanted you to have the slower parts too, because the slower parts are where the actual healing happened, not in the 3 minutes of recording, but in the 18 months afterward that nobody watches from the outside. If there's one thing I'd want you to carry away from all of this, It's this. The version of you who stays quiet to keep the peace is not more loving than the version of you who finally speaks up. She's just more afraid, usually for reasons that make complete sense given everything she's lived through. There's no shame in having been her for a while. I was her for 5 years. But there's a cost to staying her forever. And eventually, someone in your life is going to hand you the bill. Whether it's a door left slightly ajar, a phone call you overhear by accident, or simply the slow, accumulating exhaustion of holding up a life that was never quite yours to begin with. I got lucky, in a strange way, that my reckoning arrived all at once, in one devastating, clarifying night, instead of stretched out across decades the way it does for so many women. I don't take that luck lightly. Not everyone gets a door left open at exactly the right moment. Some people have to make the decision without ever getting proof. Just an accumulation of quiet doubts they eventually have to trust on their own, without a recording to justify it to anyone else. If that's you, right now, reading this, if you don't have a 3-minute audio file to hold up as evidence, only a persistent, uncomfortable feeling you've been talking yourself out of for longer than you'd like to admit, I want to tell you that the feeling itself is enough. You don't need a recorded confession to be allowed to protect yourself. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to keep your own name on your own deed. You are allowed to want proof of someone's intentions without being made to feel like wanting it is somehow the real betrayal. My mother spent her whole life teaching me that lesson without ever fully explaining it out loud, mostly through the quiet example of her own hard-won independence. A coffee can hidden under a floorboard at 16, a bank account opened alone at 19, a cardigan finished with trembling hands in the last weeks of her life. 2 small embroidered flowers standing in for the only 2 things she ever really wanted for me: peace, safety. I found my way to both, eventually, on my own terms, in a home with only my name on the deed and a life built out of decisions nobody else got to quietly make on my behalf. If you're standing somewhere near the edge of your own decision right now, afraid of what it costs to walk away, I hope you remember that the cost of staying is almost always higher. It's just better hidden, tucked behind honeyed voices and warm handshakes, and the specific, seductive comfort of being told over and over that you're finally part of a family. Sometimes you are. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you find out in time that you're not, and get to go build the real thing yourself, on your own foundation, brick by brick, exactly the way the women before you did. I didn't go looking for updates on Grant's family after everything's settled. But Seattle is smaller than people think, especially inside the same industry, and news has a way of reaching you even when you've stopped asking for it. About 18 months after the wedding that never happened, I heard through a former coworker, entirely by accident over drinks after a conference, that Pamela had sold the Capitol Hill apartment, the same one I'd stood outside of that night, hand hovering over the bell. Apparently, the building had gone through a wave of renovations that pushed property values up significantly, and she'd cashed out at a healthy profit, using the proceeds, from what I could gather secondhand, to relocate somewhere outside the city, closer to relatives on her side of the family I'd never actually met during our 5 years together. I felt almost nothing hearing it. Not satisfaction, not resentment. Just a mild, distant curiosity. The kind you feel reading about a stranger's life update in an alumni newsletter. It occurred to me, listening to the story, that Pamela had spent years scheming to acquire a windfall through my condo, only to end up manufacturing a much smaller one, entirely on her own, through an ordinary real estate market she had no actual control over. I don't think there was any grand cosmic justice in that. Property values just went up, the way they sometimes do, for reasons that have nothing to do with anyone's character. Grant's consultancy, I heard around the same time, was still operating, modestly, out of a shared office space downtown. Nothing dramatic, no visible collapse, no satisfying downfall. Just an ordinary small business doing ordinary small business things, presumably funded through ordinary channels this time, since the extraordinary one he'd once been counting on had never materialized.
I want to be honest about something here, because I think stories like mine sometimes get twisted in the retelling into something closer to a revenge fantasy than they actually were. I never once wished specific hardship on any of them. I didn't spend my evenings hoping the consultancy would fail, or that Pamela's new town would somehow disappoint her, or that Brooke's car, wherever she'd ended up buying one, would break down at an inconvenient moment. That version of the story, the one where the wronged woman gets to watch her enemies suffer in satisfying, narratively appropriate ways, makes for a better ending, maybe, but it isn't the one I actually got, and I've made my peace with that. What I got instead was simpler and, I think, ultimately more useful. I got my own life back, cleanly, without needing anyone else's misfortune to make that recovery feel complete. Their story kept going, somewhere else, without me in it. Mine kept going too, right here, and eventually that stopped feeling like an unfinished ending and started feeling like the entire point. Brooke, as far as I ever learned, finished her degree and moved into some kind of marketing role at a mid-sized company, the exact independent career she used to talk to me about so earnestly, back when I still believed her enthusiasm was genuine curiosity rather than careful research. I hope, honestly, that she built something real out of it eventually, separate from whatever she absorbed at her mother's kitchen table growing up. People aren't always permanently the worst version of themselves at 22. I try to remember that, even about her. The uncle who'd called me that first week, stern and puzzled, reached out one more time, almost a year later, out of the blue. I almost didn't pick up, recognizing the number after all that time, but something made me answer anyway. "Harper?" he said, sounding older than I remembered, quieter. I wanted to apologize for that call back at the start. I didn't know the full story then. I do now. I appreciated it more than I expected to. "Thank you for saying that," I told him. "I hope things are going all right, for what it's worth." "They're going," he said, in the particular tone of a man who'd clearly learned more about his own family in the past year than he'd wanted to. "That's about all I can say for them these days." We didn't talk long after that. There wasn't much left to say. But I found, hanging up, that I felt something close to closure I hadn't expected to still be waiting for. Naomi's wedding, that following spring, ended up being one of the best days of that entire year, and I want to tell you about it because I think it matters that this story doesn't end with me permanently wary of weddings themselves, only of the specific kind of dishonesty that had almost ruined mine. It was small, intentional, held at a restored barn out near the Snoqualmie Valley, the kind of venue that photographs beautifully without trying too hard. I stood up as her maid of honor in a pale green dress Naomi had picked out herself, insisting, half joking, that this time she wanted final say over everyone's outfit, including her own mother's. I gave a toast that afternoon that I'd rewritten probably a dozen times in the weeks leading up to it, terrified of accidentally saying something that sounded, even obliquely, like it was really about my own story instead of hers. In the end, I kept it simple. "I've known Naomi for over a decade," I said, glass raised, hands steadier than I expected them to be. "And in all that time, The thing I've admired most about her isn't that she found someone who loves her. It's that she never once needed to. She was already whole, entirely on her own, and Theo simply got the extraordinary privilege of joining a life that was already complete without him. I think that's the only kind of marriage worth actually having. Two whole people choosing each other, instead of two halves hoping to finally add up to something. Naomi cried. Theo cried, which surprised absolutely everyone, including him. I caught Corinne's eye across the room afterward, and she gave me a small, knowing nod, the kind that didn't need any further explanation between us. I danced that night more than I had in years, with Naomi, with her new husband's genuinely delightful uncle who turned out to be an excellent dancer, with Marcus, of all people, who I'd invited as a friend and who came, entirely without complication, as exactly that. At some point near the end of the evening, standing outside the barn in the cool spring air, catching my breath after an aggressively enthusiastic group dance number, I found myself thinking, with something close to wonder, about how completely ordinary that moment felt. A wedding. A friend's happiness, my own uncomplicated joy at witnessing it, with no undertow of grief or comparison pulling at the edges of it the way I might have expected, a year or two earlier, that it always would. Weddings, it turned out, had never been the problem. Mine specifically had been. I was relieved that night to finally know the difference for certain, instead of just hoping it was true. Driving home that evening, windows cracked to let the cool night air in, I thought about my mother, the way I still did most days, though the sharp edges of that grief had softened considerably by then into something gentler, more like companionship than loss. I thought about the cardigan, still somewhere out in the world, in an apartment or a donation bin or a landfill. I'd never know which. I thought about the two small embroidered flowers and the two words they stood for, and how I'd finally, fully, after everything, gotten both of them for myself. Peace. Safety. Not from a marriage, not from a man's family finally deciding to love me for real instead of performing it. From myself. Built slowly, deliberately, out of exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous decisions my mother had spent her whole life making before me. Decisions I'd finally learned to recognize as the real inheritance all along. Worth infinitely more than any condo, any deed, any wedding dress ever could have been. If you've made it this far with me, through all of it, thank you. I hope some piece of this story finds you exactly when you need it, the way my mother's warnings found me, eventually, one cold night outside a door I almost didn't stop in front of at all. People sometimes ask me, when they hear a shortened version of this story, whether I regret the things I gave away in the aftermath. The dress, mostly, since that's the detail that seems to stick with people the longest. I understand the question. $9,500 is a real amount of money, and giving it away to a stranger, rather than reselling it or simply keeping it in a box in a closet somewhere, strikes a lot of people as either impossibly generous or slightly reckless, depending on their own relationship with money and grief. I don't regret it, but I want to be precise about why, because I think the reasoning matters more than the gesture itself. I didn't donate the dress because I'm a particularly saintly person, or because I needed a dramatic symbolic act to prove to myself, or to anyone else, that I'd truly moved on. I donated it because keeping it would have meant making a decision, every single time I opened that closet, about what to feel about it. And I was tired, by that point, of my own home asking me questions I didn't want to keep answering. Giving it away wasn't generosity so much as it was maintenance. I was clearing a hazard out of my own space, the way you'd finally get rid of a stove that no longer worked properly. Except this particular hazard happened to be beautiful and expensive and soaked in 9 months of memory. What I kept, by contrast, tells a more interesting story, I think. I kept every receipt from every transfer I ever made to Grant's family, even after the debt was settled, filed neatly in a folder in my desk that I still, to this day, occasionally take out and look through. Not out of any lingering resentment, but almost the way you'd look through old photographs from a trip that went badly. Not fondly exactly, but with a kind of clear-eyed respect for how much you learned from it. I kept the recording too, though I've never actually listened to it again since the day I played it for Corinne and later for Grant himself over the phone. It exists on an old phone, powered off, in the same drawer as the receipts. I don't need to hear it again to remember every word. But something in me isn't ready to delete it either, and I've stopped questioning that instinct. Some evidence isn't kept for practical reasons. It's kept because it proves, on the days your own memory starts to feel unreliable, that something you clearly remember actually happened, exactly the way you remember it happening. I kept the canvas bag, obviously, and everything inside it, including a handful of photographs I still haven't fully worked up the nerve to look through carefully. Pictures, Mrs. Alvarez told me, from even further back than I expected. My mother as a young woman, before I existed at all, in places and with people I never got the chance to ask her about. I kept my mother's second cardigan, the cream-colored one with the uneven stitching, which I still wear most winters, more now for the memory than for the actual warmth, though it does, admittedly, still keep me plenty warm, too. And I kept, above everything else, the promise I made her in that hospital room with the ugly parking lot view. Peace and safety over anything that merely looks impressive on paper. I think that promise is the only real inheritance that ended up mattering in the end. Everything else, the condo, the settlement, even the story itself, is just the evidence of what happens when you actually keep a promise like that, instead of letting it quietly erode under the weight of somebody else's expectations. There's a version of me, somewhere just slightly to the left of the life I actually ended up living, who never went back for that cardigan, who left it on Pamela's sofa, got married the next afternoon in a dress that cost nearly $10,000, and spent the following years, slowly, almost imperceptibly, becoming exactly the kind of resource her new family had always intended her to be. I think about that woman sometimes, not with fear exactly, but with a kind of distant, clinical curiosity, the way you might think about a character in a novel you read once and never finished. I imagine her a few years further down that other road. The condo eventually transferred, sold. The proceeds absorbed into Grant's consultancy under a name that no longer legally required her permission to spend it. I imagine her managing, somehow, to convince herself that this was simply what marriage looked like, that the quiet, persistent unease she felt every time money came up was just her own trust issues, something to work on in therapy rather than something correctly, accurately detecting an actual threat. I imagine her having children eventually, maybe, raising them inside a family that had already demonstrated, clearly, exactly how it viewed anyone who married into it. I wonder whether she would have taught her own daughter someday the same lessons my mother taught me, or whether the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from constantly managing somebody else's expectations would have worn that instinct down to nothing by then. I don't know how that version of my life ends. I never had to find out, and I'm careful not to pretend I know for certain it would have been a tragedy. Maybe Grant would have changed eventually, grown a spine where his family was concerned, found some way to actually protect me the way he claimed in that coffee shop a year later that he wished he had. I can't rule that out completely. People do change sometimes under enough pressure, in enough time. But I don't think I regret not finding out. I think there's something almost sacred about the specific kind of luck involved in getting to close a door before you walk all the way through it, instead of only afterward, once you're already standing on the other side, with nowhere left to retreat to. What I became instead, and the life I actually got to live, is someone I like considerably more than I expected to, back on that first sleepless night in my rented studio, cigarette smoke curling toward a ceiling I no longer even live under anymore. I became a woman with her own name on her own deed, her own retirement account, her own small, hard-won collection of instincts she trusts without needing outside permission to trust them. I became someone capable of loving again, cautiously, without letting caution calcify into permanent suspicion. I became, in the most ordinary and unglamorous sense possible, exactly the kind of woman my mother spent her whole life quietly, patiently trying to raise, without ever once explaining out loud exactly why it mattered so much that I turn out this way. I think if she were here now, standing in my kitchen in Ballard, looking out at a view she never got to see in person, she'd have opinions about the paint color, and she'd probably tell me the throw pillows don't match anything else in the room. And then, eventually, quietly, in the particular way she always saved her real feelings for last, she'd tell me she was proud. Not of the condo, or the job, or even the story itself, just of the fact that when the moment finally came, the door left ajar, the finger hovering over the bell, the 3 minutes that decided everything, I chose, without needing anyone else's permission, to save myself. I'm writing the last of this 2 years out from that night in the car, headlights flashing behind me, the screech of tires on wet asphalt, a cardigan I never got back sitting somewhere I'll never see again. Enough time has passed that the story no longer feels like something that's still happening to me. It feels, finally, like something that happened, past tense, with an ending I got to choose the shape of. My condo in Ballard looks nothing like it did that first night. Mattress on the bare floor, underfloor heating humming beneath me like a small, patient promise. There's furniture now, most of it mismatched on purpose, gathered slowly from places that meant something, rather than assembled all at once from a single showroom the way I once imagined a real home was supposed to come together. The painting of the corner store from my mother's old neighborhood still hangs in the entryway. I added a second one last spring, of the overlook in Chelan. Not because I'm still attached to the memory of a proposal that turned out to be the opening scene of something else entirely, but because the view itself was genuinely beautiful, and I've decided I'm allowed to keep beautiful things, even when they arrive to me through a complicated door. Corinne retired from active litigation last winter, though she still takes the occasional case, mostly, she tells me, out of habit rather than necessity. We still have dinner most months. She still, occasionally, introduces me as her other niece, and I've stopped even noticing the correction I used to feel obligated to make. Naomi and Theo had their first child this past autumn, a girl, and I sat in the hospital waiting room for 6 hours with a level of patience that surprised even me, holding a coffee that had long since gone cold, thinking, more than once, about my own mother sitting in rooms exactly like that one, decades earlier, at the start of a life she'd spend the rest of hers quietly protecting. Marcus and I still cross paths occasionally,
Always warmly, always a little wistfully, the way you do with someone whose timing simply never quite lined up with yours. He's engaged now, to someone I've never met but hope, genuinely, is good to him.
I mean that without any residue of old feeling attached to it. That's its own kind of progress, I've learned. Being able to wish someone well without needing to perform the wishing for anyone's benefit, including your own. I've dated a little since then. Nothing serious enough yet to earn its own chapter in a story like this one, though I've stopped assuming that means something is wrong with me. I think, if anything, it means the opposite. I'm no longer in a hurry to fold my life into someone else's, simply to avoid the discomfort of building it slowly, alone, on my own timeline. The uncle who called twice, first to scold me, later to apologize, sends a card every year around the holidays. Brief, kind, entirely uncomplicated. I've come to genuinely look forward to it. An odd, small thread of continuity from a family I otherwise walked away from completely. I never did get the cardigan back, and at some point in the last 2 years, I stopped wishing I had. I understand now that the cardigan itself was never really the inheritance. The inheritance was the instinct it represented. My mother's hands, shaking but steady, stitching 2 small flowers into a collar because she wanted me to carry the idea of peace and safety with me, even after she no longer could, in whatever form that idea managed to survive. I carry it now the way she intended, I think. Not folded in a drawer, not draped over the arm of someone else's sofa, but built into the actual architecture of how I live, into the retirement account I check without dread, into the receipts I still keep out of habit rather than anxiety, into the quiet, unglamorous, entirely undramatic peace of an ordinary Tuesday evening, alone in a kitchen that belongs only to me, cooking dinner for one, completely, thoroughly at rest. If you've read this whole story, from the cold night in the car all the way to this kitchen, 2 years and 1 whole life later, I hope you'll forgive me for not giving you a tidier villain's comeuppance or a more triumphant final scene. I've come to believe those endings, however satisfying, aren't actually the point of stories like mine. The point was never really about what happened to them. It was always about what I got to build afterward, once I finally stopped waiting for someone else's family to decide whether I belonged. I did belong, it turned out, just not there. And I'm endlessly grateful now that I found that out in time to go looking for the place I actually did. If you've made it all the way to the end of this, I want to say one more thing directly, the way I would if we were sitting across a table from each other instead of on opposite ends of a screen. Somebody, somewhere, reading this right now, is standing exactly where I stood. Not necessarily outside a literal door, hand hovering over a literal bell, but in the metaphorical version of that hallway, sensing something is wrong and quietly talking themselves out of trusting it. Maybe it's a partner who gets strangely evasive about money. Maybe it's a future in-law whose compliments always seem to arrive attached to a request. Maybe it's just a low, persistent hum of unease you've been calling anxiety for years, because the alternative, actually naming what you're afraid of, feels too enormous to hold. I want to tell you, as plainly as I can, that the unease is data. It isn't a character flaw. It isn't proof that you're incapable of trusting people or too damaged by something in your past to recognize real love when it shows up. Sometimes unease is simply your own mind doing exactly the job it's supposed to do, quietly assembling a pattern out of 100 small moments you haven't consciously connected yet. You don't need a recording. You don't need a door left conveniently ajar at exactly the right moment. You are allowed to ask direct questions about money, about property, about intentions, and you are allowed to notice, carefully, how someone responds when you do. Real love does not flinch at transparency. It welcomes it because it has nothing to hide from it. I got my proof by accident, on an ordinary night, driving back for a sweater. Most people never get proof that clean. Most people have to make the harder decision, the one without a recording to justify it to anyone else, the one that requires trusting your own read of a situation, even when you can't fully explain it out loud yet. If that's where you are right now, I want you to know that decision is no less valid for lacking a dramatic reveal. You don't owe anyone a 3-minute audio file before you're allowed to protect yourself. My mother spent a lifetime building the instincts that eventually saved me, one quiet, unglamorous decision at a time. A coffee can under a floorboard, a bank account opened alone, a promise extracted from her daughter in a hospital room with a view of nothing worth looking at. None of it looked dramatic while it was happening. All of it turned out to matter enormously later, exactly when I needed it most. I hope, whatever your version of that hallway looks like, you find your own way through it in time. I hope you get to build the kind of ordinary, unglamorous peace I eventually built for myself. Not out of a dramatic reveal necessarily, but simply out of finally, fully believing you're allowed to choose yourself. Even when it costs you something that looked, on paper, like it was supposed to be the biggest day of your life. It wasn't. The biggest day of my life turned out to be a perfectly ordinary Tuesday, almost 2 years later, standing in a kitchen that belonged only to me, realizing I hadn't thought about any of it in weeks, not out of avoidance, but because I'd finally, completely, stopped needing to. That's the ending I actually got. I hope, in your own time, in your own way, you get to write yourself one just like it.